Yeah, so I chose two papers which are on the same topic, and they were both actually accepted at CHI last year at the same time. And I think it's quite interesting to present them at the same time because the methods they used are different, but their results are actually pretty similar. And so they are both about fairness practices when developing machine learning models. And so, yeah, and just investigating these practices and the limitations when using especially fairness toolkits. Yeah, I chose these papers for several reasons. First is because, well, it's about human AI interaction. So what we're looking into in this group, but I think it's quite different from most previous work on fairness and machine learning models, because it's now looking into the practices of people developing the models and not perceptions of end users or subjects of the decisions. So which is quite new. Yeah, so these papers are interesting because they are using a very diverse set of methodologies, and I think this can serve as inspiration for other works we could do. Yeah, and the last is out of selfishness because I think it's pretty close to a work that we want to develop around fairness toolkits. So it's good to have these papers in mind to actually identify our own contributions compared to this. But so before maybe entering into each paper, I wanted to give some background. I didn't know who knows really about these works on fairness or not, but let me know if you all already know about that. So I think the related work can be divided into two sets of topics, one which are more, let's say, technical, about metrics and mitigation methods for fairness, and the other which is more on previous HCI works. So I think to sort of model the problem, we can say that someone is trying first to, well, develop a machine learning model. Then this model would be deployed into real context. And so when the model is deployed, the goal is to get outputs, which would be referring to different decision subjects and labels associated to these decision subjects. And so then once we have these outputs, there is a certain decision which is taken for these subjects, either by humans or directly by following the outputs. And typically, this is where we see there are some harms happening. So typically what we talk about when we say unfairness of discrimination. And these harms can be, well, are typically associated to the decision subjects, but they could also be actually caused by the machine learning model, but on, I don't know, the rest of the environment except the decision subjects. And so you might have heard of one of several examples already around that. So for instance, here is the one corresponding to the COMPASS system, so which is used to predict the likeliness of someone to recidivize once they're already committed a crime once. And yeah, this system was, let's say, accused of being racist using different fairness metrics, and contesting which one is actually important to say that it would be sort of racist and which one is not. And so that leads to the technical works that are done on the topic. The main first main category is to actually develop fairness metrics. And these metrics are typically measured on the outputs of the deployed model, and not necessarily on actually the actual decisions that were taken later on. I think on the graph, you can see sort of different examples of metrics already. So for instance, you define two groups of population and compute the accuracy, so the first part of the plot on these two groups of population and compare the accuracy for the two. But then you can also use different performance metrics computed again on the two different groups and comparing the difference between the results. So for instance, the second plot is showing whether a defendant who didn't commit a crime is actually predicted as likely to recidivate or not. And here, for instance, with this metric, you can see a larger difference between the two groups of population compared to using accuracy. And that's why, for instance, for this compass system, it was like polemical, let's say, to say whether it was racist, because it depends on the metric you would use. And so still on the technical works, next to the metrics, then there are all these sets of mitigation methods that are proposed, and that typically can be applied on the model development. And they consist in transforming the training data set for this model, or changing the way it was actually trained. So for instance, the loss function, and otherwise also changing the approach to post-process its outputs. So for instance, what you do with the probability distributions that you get in the outputs of the model. So this is the technical work, and based on that, various companies or also institutions build different toolkits which gather the fairness metrics and mitigation methods. And the goals of these toolkits are to actually facilitate, the implementation application of these methods by practitioners typically. And that's also what the two papers I was looking at are focusing on. So understanding whether the toolkits really answer the needs of practitioners who would have fairness in mind when developing a model. Maybe an interesting point is that while these toolkits only consist of some of the metrics and mitigation methods, but we also know that there are other works which look at the limitations of these metrics and the methods subsequently. So for instance, the fact that the metrics are only applied to the outputs of the models and not to the actual decisions that are taken. So the fairness measure of the entire system might not really correspond to what we actually are able to measure, or the fact that the metrics are only applied to the decision subjects, so to the input outputs of the machine learning models, but this doesn't then allow to measure their potential impact that the decisions that are taken have on the rest of the environment. Or for instance, limitations around the data sets, which might be that are used for training, which might also be offensive in other ways, and so which would also create other harms. And these are also some limitations that the papers reflect on in the discussions. So this is for the more technical aspects of fairness, let's say, and then there is another set of works which are from the human-computer interaction community. And so in these works, there are lots of papers which study how people perceive the fairness of machine learning models. So mostly with user studies, and then they compare these to the proposed fairness metrics and see which ones are more aligning with public perceptions than others, for instance, or whether they are all limited. And then the second set of works is about challenges faced by practitioners when they want to develop fair models. But all these, there are mostly two papers, but they are not actually focusing on toolkits, probably because they were actually published before most of the toolkits were built. And they were consisting of interviews and surveys of different practitioners to understand what kind of challenges they face for different kinds of applications. Typically, the challenges were around the fact that they wouldn't know which metric to choose or how to actually apply these metrics or mitigation methods, because they wouldn't have the right set of data available, like wouldn't have these protected attributes corresponding to the groups of population. And other similar challenges. But so none of this is looking at the toolkits, and that's what the papers I looked at are doing. The first of this paper is this one, entitled "The Landscape and Gaps in Open Source Fairness Toolkits." It's also, I think, the longer to explain, so it's good that it's first. So basically their idea was that, as I was saying, there are now quite a lot of toolkits that are developed, but it hasn't really been studied whether they are really satisfying the needs of practitioners in industry who would be developing models with fairness in mind. And so to study whether this answer their needs, they used a sort of mixed method where they first had a focus group to understand globally what are the toolkits that are used, what are the needs that they might be answering. Then they performed a set of semi-structured interviews to further gather insights, and later on also anonymous surveys to generalize this insight that they got with a larger number of practitioners. And they also compared different toolkits by looking to their documentation. I will explain in more detail each of the steps afterwards. And so, as I was saying, the main difference from previous work, beside the fact that they are looking into toolkits and not the previous work, is that they actually engaged with practitioners who have experience with the toolkits, or at least with fairness. And it's not always the case, especially with previous works, which were looking into perceptions from the public and not actual practitioners. So the contributions are first gaps identified between what the toolkits can do and what are the practitioners' needs, and also opportunities for research and creation of better toolkits, both on addressing these gaps and also usability issues of the current toolkits. So the first step of their work was this exploratory focus group. The goal was to actually identify what toolkits to study next in more detail, and initial insights on what exactly to actually study. And so in these focus groups, they had 18 practitioners that they recruited from a data charity in the UK. And they were all interested in machine learning and ethics generally already. And so the focus group was a one-day event with all these practitioners. They were divided into multiple groups and asked to identify various toolkits, or maybe toolkits they already use. In this case, it was not only on fairness, but also explainability, I think also auditing, and two other topics. And they wanted them, so to identify toolkits on the topic and rate their functionality and user friendliness. And from these 5 groups, the first result was that among these different topics, so not only fairness, but explainability, etc., the topic with the most toolkits was probably around fairness. And so that's why they chose this topic for the rest of the paper. And so more specifically, they chose the 5 toolkits that I listed afterwards. So for instance, the IBM toolkit, IIF360, or the Google one called the What If tool, for instance. And they identified initial features or functionalities that these toolkits more or less all allow for. For instance, so computing the standard fairness metrics, also allowing to use a few of the mitigation methods for fairness, comparing the fairness metrics across various models, etc. But they also started to identify a few gaps within these toolkits. For instance, the fact that each of them don't allow for the same things, whether it's auditing, mitigating, or also providing guidance for this mitigation, and even for just auditing. Another issue was that all of the toolkits require already quite a lot of experience with fairness and data science in general, which might not be the case for all practitioners who would use them in practice. And then they had other hints at other gaps around the differences in what someone would expect and what the toolkits actually allowed to do. So then once they had these 5 toolkits, they reviewed the documentation. So it allowed them to, the goal was to, know what each toolkit can do exactly. But also by reviewing this, it's easier for practitioners later on to choose a toolkit for their actual goal, depending on what the goal is. And it also allows to identify needs for future toolkits. So what none of the toolkit can do, or at least not all of the functionalities could be served within one toolkit. And so for that, they mostly looked into documentation and actually used these toolkits. I guess it's not really useful to enter into detail in this, but they provide this table with the toolkits in rows and all the functionalities in columns, and rate each toolkit based on this. So then the last part of the work is about these interviews, so semi-structured interviews and more general surveys on these 5 toolkits. And there the goal is to actually get more insights into what are the features of the toolkits that are the most useful or expected by practitioners, and how well actually the toolkits serve these functionalities. And so the survey was used to generalize these insights. And for that, they interviewed first 15 practitioners who already knew about fairness and machine learning. They asked them about first their demographics, then asked them to rate the importance of each feature they defined in the previous steps, and then let them see screenshots of the current toolkits and discuss whether what was shown to them would actually answer the feature that they had rated before. And then the interviews were analyzed by coding them on different topics. For the surveys, it was rather similar. They showed screenshots of the toolkits and asked to discuss or rate whether the screenshots would really allow the feature that was mentioned above. And these were the main findings that they discussed next. So the first one is that all these toolkits have a steep learning curve because of the number of metrics and mitigations methods that are presented and the lack of guidance to actually use them. And so related to that is the lack of tailored user experience, because some have more knowledge than others. And so presenting all these metrics methods could be an information overload for certain of them, but also can be oversimplification when some functionalities are missing, for instance, comparing these metrics over different machine learning models. And what was also missing is the fact that it doesn't really guide you on the entire life cycle of a machine learning model, whether it's about developing the model, testing it, or deploying it, etc. And so it was often complicated to actually integrate these toolkits within the workflows that they are already used to develop the models. So then they conclude with various opportunities for future work. So since for now they were interviewing mostly people who already have experience with fairness and possibly with the toolkits, they were saying that it would be nice in the future to actually understand whether these insights would vary for people who have less experience, who are less familiar with fairness in general, because they are the actual targets of the toolkits as well. Then, of course, it would be about developing new toolkits which address all the gaps that they identified. They also noticed that even the first practitioners they interviewed didn't know about all the toolkits. And so one more problem is to actually raise awareness and accessibility of these. Like they had 5 in the study, but there are even more typically. And then, yeah, depending on the results, if we would also interview other types of practitioners, it would be probably important to adapt the toolkits to each kind of user, which would be, again, a new research question. Then they were suggesting that it's not really clear what are the responsibilities of other stakeholders besides practitioners. Maybe these other stakeholders could actually also help in the use of the toolkits, for instance, to define a metric to use. And yeah, this hasn't been investigated either until now. And the last future work they mentioned was studying how using the toolkits, knowing that there are different limitations to this, actually provides a reductionist definition of fairness for the practitioners, or is actually answering the actual needs that practitioners of the society would have.
I have a question about the motivation of the first work, right? So obviously very interesting, and we've discussed some of these things before. So I was wondering whether they reflect on, or what your insights are on consistency in approaches for designing fairness toolkits, right? Because one of the obvious things is that there is a clear lack of consistency across different toolkits and the notions of fairness, but do we even want consistency? So of course, I imagine that there is, a well designed way of understanding what the requirements are for any given fairness toolkit. We could come up with that, right? And maybe we could try and sketch out the space of what are these desirable requirements. But purely out of the scientific method, differences in approaches could be argued to be desirable, right? As long as they all prescribe to whatever a well-defined notion of fairness is. Isn't, a difference desirable?
Yeah, so I think they were saying there is a lack of consistency, probably because they noticed that anyway, people were not aware of all the toolkits. So I think it was more or less similar to making a random choice on the toolkit that you would use. And so in that case, if you just choose one because you know it exists, well, it might not actually answer the needs that you actually have. And so if all toolkits were more or less consistent, then you would be sure that you get the functionalities you need, or at least you get the same functionalities as when using another toolkit. But yeah, I agree that probably consistency is not the best. Also, that's maybe what they hint in the discussion, because they say that different practitioners might have different needs depending on maybe their familiarity with fairness already and whether they're actually interested in solving these issues or not. So yeah, actually in the end, probably consistency for the different toolkits is not necessary, but at least each of them probably should provide more guidance, because that was one of the functionalities that they seem to say is missing. And even for people who have more familiarity, it seemed to be missing. So maybe some of the functionalities would need to be consistent across toolkits, but not all of them.
Okay, so I have a related question, but I see that there are others. So yeah, I'll wait.
Yeah, I have one that's not written in the chat yet, but it's always one that comes up anytime I hear a presentation on anything with fairness and bias. And that is, how do the authors even define fairness for this? Because depending on your task or your domain, the definition of what fairness is can differ. Fairness in terms of a recommender for books or movies is completely different than fairness in terms of the facial recognition on future crime prediction.
Yeah, so I think that's maybe also actually connected to Charles' question. So they don't really have, I think, a really structured process to build these toolkits. So identifying the needs for different use cases and practitioners, and then building the toolkit according to that. But I think they mostly reuse, just the metrics and methods that already exist, which are mostly for classification tasks for machine learning, and then just build some kind of GitHub repo where it's easy to access all the metrics and methods, more
Okay.
than actually adhering to specific use case.
So rather than defining them themselves, they just show that these people defined it for this, for their toolkit, and did it actually do that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think they were maybe reviewing that at some point in the table. So they were saying, for instance, the models that are covered, so they were talking about regression or classification, multi-class outcome. And I think that's the closest to what you could imagine separating per use case. Because
they also have the group fairness definition there with like equal opportunity. So that's what I was looking for, is that group fairness columns.
Yeah, the problem though is that it doesn't actually help the practitioner choose which fairness metric or would be adapted to their own use case, especially as you were saying, maybe for classification this can work, but for instance recommender systems, the fairness metrics that exist there are typically not included in the toolkits.
On that question, so my question is also about stakeholders, right? I think the roles, the types of stakeholders is really important here, right? Because if they have different wishes, then what they want from the fairness tool, like what kind of functions should be there, right? They should be completely different. So I wonder how. So in their study, what are the interviewees? Who are those people that they had?
Yeah, so it's mostly data scientists who are interested in fairness issues and actually solving these fairness issues. And they were actually saying that it's limited in a way because they don't look at other data scientists who might not actually be aware of these issues, and or data scientists who are not incentivized to actually answer this either. So it's just a specific group of stakeholders. They were coming all from some data science charity, which is mostly volunteer data scientists helping to create fair models for certain organizations.
I see. But those data scientists, they are also quite I mean, their job is inherently linked to what other stakeholders need, right? So they should have a broad, but that might be an interesting question. Like, to what extent those data scientists, they understand the needs from all these different types of stakeholders who are impacted by those fairness tools, right? If there's I'm sure there's a discrepancy a lot. So that could be interesting.
So Agathe, you said something about the second work that's where they dived deeper into understanding practitioner behavior.
Yes, in the second work, they were actually providing like Google Colab notebook, and they were like already implementing one toolkit. I think they took 3 or 4 in total. And they were actually asking the practitioners to ask certain questions by looking into the notebook and trying to answer. And so they were looking at what are the difficulties in answering these questions using these notebooks or not. But I thought it was a bit lacking because they don't actually describe what the practitioners did. They just provide these insights on what are the limitations of the toolkits. They had copy-pasted the list of insights they had. They created these rubrics which tell you what toolkits can do or should do maybe. And then they were saying whether each toolkit can do it. But they never actually describe what kind of reflections practitioners have when answering questions.
Yeah, it's interesting that many of these things also reside on the users, right? So of course you come up with some of these criteria, but then how do users rely on them is what eventually matters, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and they provide a few quotes to support the fact that these criteria are needed. But still I feel it's still missing to know how what was the process of each practitioner and what questions they ask themselves.